If the Alpha King had once come down to his own kennels to learn which servant his motherless sons actually loved, the disaster at the banquet would never have happened. But he was a busy man and grand, and so when two royal pups overturned a realm to sit beside a kitchen omega, the fault, traced honestly, was his. Wenna had never wanted the pups. That was the thing nobody upstairs seemed able to believe. She had wanted a quiet post, warm bread, and a corner of the lower kitchen where no one looked at her twice, which in the palace of Duncrag was the closest thing an omega of no name could get to peace. Instead, she had two half-wild heirs to the throne of Kelvane, who would settle for no one else, and a great many people above her who resented her deeply for it. It had started the winter. Their mother died. The nurses came with their soft hands and their softer voices, and the two pups bit every one of them and fled into the dark under the stairs. It was Wenna, carrying down the night ashes, who had found them there. Two small gray shapes, shivering with grief and refusing to be children again. She had not coaxed them or commanded them. She had simply sat on the cold floor, said nothing at all, and after a while begun to hum the tune her own mother used to hum over the wash. The larger pup crept out first. The smaller one followed. By morning they were asleep against her ribs, and she had a problem she would carry for 3 years. Now she knew them better than she knew her own hands. Bracken was the elder, old as a thrown stone, forever certain that whatever he wanted was owed to him at once. Linnet was younger and quieter and watched everything, which made her twice as dangerous, because Bracken only broke what was in front of him while Linnet planned. They shifted when they liked, and refused when they liked, and lately they had liked to stay wolves. Small and swift and impossible to catch, because a wolf did not have to sit through lessons, and a wolf could not be told its mother was not coming back. Between them, they had emptied the dovecote in a single, glorious afternoon, flooded the still room to the ankles, and once memorably treed the master of hounds until well past dark, and it was Wenna who had mended every disaster and stood for every scolding so that no one above stairs thought to send the two of them somewhere colder and further away. That very morning she had caught Bracken with his whole head in the milk crock and Linnet standing lookout, and she had not scolded them, because there was no milk in the crock to speak of, and both of them knew it. Their allowance of meat and warm milk went missing somewhere between the pantry and the nursery, as it had gone missing every week that season, so that Wenna fed them from her own plate more nights than she would admit, and said nothing, because saying something was how a girl of no name lost her place. She had learned to keep her sums to herself. She kept a great many sums. She knew the grain for the lower kitchens, came short every second month, and always had a clean excuse. She knew which storeman grew nervous when a tally was read aloud. She knew, the way you know weather, that a great house was rotting quietly from its cellars, while the men above it counted nothing but their own comfort. None of it was hers to mend, and all of it seemed to land on her regardless. When the East Pantry sent up spoiled meat 3 days running, and swore blind it was sound, it was Wenna. The cook had screamed at for refusing to serve it, and Wenna, who was proven right only after a footman was sick across the passage. When a whole barrel of good salt walked out of the count, it was Wenna who could have named the 2 men who had carried it into the dusk, and Wenna who knew far better than to name them. She had a place, or the pale shadow of one, and a girl of no name kept her place by keeping quiet. So she fed the pups from her own plate and swallowed her sums, and told herself that a warm corner and 2 gray shadows who loved her were more than someone like her had any right to expect. She had very nearly come to believe it. "You will both be children by supper," she told the pups, plaiting a loose rope of dough between her fingers, "and you will let Mrs. Odell wash behind your ears, and you will not, under any circumstance, go up to the great hall tonight." 2 gray heads tilted at her from the hearthstones. 2 pairs of pale gold eyes regarded her with the flat, patient insolence that only very small creatures and very old kings can manage. "I mean it," she said. "Tonight is not a night for you. Tonight, As all of Duncrag had been told and told again, the Alpha King would choose a queen. Alpha ladies had come from 6 holds with their fathers and their furs and their careful, hungry smiles, and the king would walk among them at the high feast and let it be known which had pleased him. It was not, strictly, Wenna's concern. She had been ordered to keep the pups below and out of sight, since 2 unruly wolf children, careening through a bride feast, was precisely the sort of thing that made a king look as though he could not order his own house. Which, Wenna thought, privately and treasonously, he could not. She had said as much once, low, to Bettany over the washing, and Bettany had gripped her wrist in the grey water and told her to hush before someone with a longer memory than sense overheard. He is the king, Bettany had said. It is his to know these things, not yours to say them. Then he ought to know them, Wenna had answered, and gone back to her scrubbing, and that had been the end of it, or so she had believed. She thought of that now, up to her wrists in dough, while above her the whole palace lit itself like a lantern for a man who did not know where his own storerooms leaked. She thought of it, and she did not think about the 2 grey shapes at the hearth, which was her single great mistake of the evening. Because when she turned to slide the loaves into the oven, the hearthstones were bare, the kitchen door stood open on the unlit passage, and somewhere far above, faint through all that stone, a horn was sounding the opening of the feast. Wenna's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Bracken," she said to the empty room. "Linnet." "No." She went up the servants' stair 2 at a time, with flowers still white to her elbows, praying to every quiet god she knew that she would catch them in a corridor, that a footman would have them by the scruff, that anything at all would happen before the pair of them reached the one room in the realm they must not reach. She was fast. She had chased them across 3 years of rooftops and root cellars, and knew every turning of the back passages better than the pups did. On the second landing, she nearly had Linnet by the tail, close enough to feel the warmth come off her fur, and then a scullery boy stepped through a doorway with a tray, and Wenna went one way and the pups went the other, gone, and she was left with her hand closing on nothing and the horns still ringing above. The great hall of Duncrag opened before her like a struck bell, all gold light and the smell of roasted meat, and 100 faces turned toward the high table, and for one held breath, everything in it was exactly as it should be. The Alpha King sat above his court in dark furs, young for a crown and grave with it, and along the near wall the Alpha ladies waited in their finery to be looked at, each one a small careful arrangement of hope. Wenna saw the scene whole in the instant before it broke, the way you see a cup in the air before it lands. Then it broke. 2 grey streaks came through the hall at a dead run, low and quick between the boots and the table legs, and the room dissolved into shrieks and knocked benches, and a lady of some high hold going over backward into a dish of pears with her slippers in the air. Bracken led, because Bracken always led. He cut clean, between the king's own guards, who lunged and caught air, and he ignored the platters, ignored the crown, ignored the 6 perfumed brides, who would each have given a hand to be noticed by that table. He ran the whole length of the hall straight to Wenna, who had stopped dead in the servants' doorway, with flour on her arms and horror on her face. He sat on her feet. Linnet arrived a breath later and pressed herself hard to Wenna's other side, and the 2 of them turned as one to face the staring court, ears up, small chests heaving, with the unmistakable air of creatures who had at last, after a long and difficult journey, arrived exactly where they meant to be. The hall went very quiet. Somewhere a goblet finished rolling and dropped off the edge of a table and rang once on the stone. No one moved to pick it up. Into that quiet, an old voice said, "Well?" It was the king's regent, Lord Rainer, who had raised the king as a boy and ruled the realm through the hard years after, and was loved for it by nearly everyone in the hall. He rose slowly from his place at the king's right hand, and his face was kind, and his eyes were doing sums. "You all saw it," Rainer said gently, turning to the room, his voice pitched to carry to the furthest bench. I would that we had not, but we did, every one of us. He spread his hands, an old man sorrowing under the weight of a thing older than himself. The blood of the pack has chosen before witnesses, before six holds, and the crown and the gathered house, and what the blood chooses so, openly, at the very hearth of the king, cannot by any word of ours be unchosen. It is the oldest law we keep. It is older than this hall, older than the crown that sits in it. We may grieve the manner of it, we may not undo it. A murmur moved through the hall, then low and uneasy, the sound of a great many people discovering all at once that they had witnessed a thing they could not now unwitness. The fathers of the six holds looked at one another down the length of the tables, and found no help in any face. One of the ladies had begun, very quietly and quite hopelessly, to weep, and not a soul moved to comfort her. They had all come so far, and dressed so carefully, and each of them understood now that the whole long evening had been decided by two small children before the soup had even gone cold. Wenna did not understand yet, not fully, what he was telling the room. But she felt the pups lean their whole warm weight against her legs, claiming her the way they had claimed the space under the stairs 3 years before, and she felt the 100 stairs fix on her like so many small cold hands, and some animal part of her understood before her mind could that something had just closed around her, quiet and complete. A trap she had never seen. Set, she looked up the length of the hall to the high table. The Alpha King had risen. He was looking at her, and at his sons pressed to her sides, and there was something working behind his still face that she could not read. Some war of things a king is not permitted to show a crowd. 6 brides waited along the wall with their smiles curdling. His whole court held its breath. He opened his mouth to give his judgment, the single word that would seal the old law, or, somehow, impossibly, break it and save the evening he had planned. And the great doors at the far end of the hall boomed open on a gust of cold night air, and a herald's voice rang out over a knot of latecomers stamping in from the road, and every head in the hall turned from Wenna at once, and the king's word, whatever it would have been, died unspoken in the noise of it. Wenna did not sleep that night, and no one would let her leave. They put her in a small warm room she had never seen, with a real bed and a fire someone else had laid, and a guard at the door who would not meet her eyes, and she sat on the edge of the strange soft bed until dawn grayed the window, with the 2 pups snoring against her, understanding by slow degrees that a warm room with a guard outside is still a cell, only better furnished than most. She had pieced the greater part of it together by morning. A servant, kinder than the rest, had told her in a whisper what the regent's words had meant. The pups had made a claim. Not a game, not a child's fond whim, but a claim, in the old shape the packs had used since long before there were kings, when a wolf that set itself at your side before the gathered blood declared you its own and dared the pack to speak against it. Done between grown wolves, it was a courtship, sweet and a little dangerous, done by the heirs of the king, before 6 holds in the crown, at the very feast meant to bind him to another woman. It was a knot no living hand in Kelvane had the standing to cut, not the disappointed ladies, not their affronted fathers, not the regent for all his law, not, it seemed, the king himself, unless he cared to stand before his whole court and tell his motherless sons to their faces that the thing they loved did not count for anything. So, she was bound to the royal house. An omega of no name, flower still dark under her nails, tied by the oldest law in the land to the very man she had called, only the day before, and only in a whisper, to Bettany, a king who could not find his own leaking storerooms with a lantern and a map. The summons came a little after the morning bells. He received her alone, which she had not expected, in a plain room off the great hall with maps pinned across every wall and a hard chair drawn up to the window and no throne anywhere in sight. Up close, the Alpha King was younger than the crown. made him look and far more tired than a young man had any right to be. He did not sit. He did not offer her the chair. He studied her a long moment the way a man studies a debt he never agreed to, and finds he cannot refuse to pay. "My sons," he said at last, "have never once come to me the way they went to you last night." It was not what she had braced for. She had braced for cold anger, for accusation, for the flat order to be gone by noon. She had not braced for that low, careful sentence with the old ache buried in the middle of it, and she found for a moment that she had no answer ready at all. "I did not ask for it, Your Grace," she said when she had one. "I would undo it, this instant, if any power on earth would let me. I know what I am, and it is not this." Something crossed his face, and was gone before she could name it. "No," he agreed, and she could not tell whether he agreed with her worth or only with her wish. "You cannot undo it, nor can I, and I am the king. The law is the law, and my house has already made a spectacle of itself before 6 holds, because 2 children love a kitchen girl more than they have ever loved their own father." He said it without heat, which was somehow worse than heat would have been. "So you will stay. You will be housed and clothed and named as the claim requires. You will keep to my sons, since you are the single living soul they will keep to. And you will understand, clearly and from the first, that being wanted by my children is a very different thing from being trusted by me." "I understand, Your Grace," Wenna said, and meant it, and was surprised and a little angry to find that it stung. He turned to the window, finished with her. She rose to go. And it was only at the door that Linnet, who had padded in silent at her heels and shifted at some point into a small solemn girl of 4 with her mother's gray eyes, tugged hard at Wenna's sleeve and said, in the clear, carrying voice of a child who has not yet learned which truths are the dangerous ones, "We had to pick you before the bad man could pick her." Wenna went very still. "Hush, now," she said softly, and glanced back at the king, who had not turned from his window and had not heard. And then she glanced past him to the far doorway, where Lord Raynor had come to stand with his kind old face, and his patient, sorrowful eyes, and who had heard, she was quite certain, every single word. The court of Duncrag, having failed to be rid of the kitchen Omega, set about the next best thing, which was making certain she understood exactly how little she was wanted. They gave her a name for the claim, because the law required one. She was to be called the King's Ward, which meant nothing and everything at once, and they gave her rooms near the nursery and gowns, too fine to scrub a floor in, and a maid named Surrey, who plainly considered the posting a punishment, and dressed her each morning in a silence you could have chipped with a knife. Then they left her to drown. No one taught her which fork or which stair or which lord must be curtsied to, and which merely nodded at, because no one intended her to last long enough to need the knowing of it. The disappointed ladies had gone home to their 6 holds, but their cousins and their aunts remained, and they had long memories and short mercy, and they had decided among themselves that a girl who still smelled faintly of yeast had no business breathing the upstairs air. There was one kindness in all that cold house, and it wore a young guard's coat. His name was Kip, and he had been set at the nursery door, and on her second night he had found her lost and turned about in the dark of the gallery, and walked her back to her own door, without once making her feel the fool. He told her which bells meant what, he told her which of the great aunts to avoid, and which merely liked the sound of their own disapproval. He was too young to have learned yet that being kind to the wrong person could cost a man his place, and Wenna, who had learned it long ago, was careful never to thank him where anyone could see. She bore the rest the way she bore everything, quietly and while paying attention. She noticed, for one thing, that the whispering stopped being amusing to the whisperers. The afternoon bracken and linnet were paraded before the assembled house in their small, stiff court clothes. The pups stood like 2 furious little statues, and would not bow, would not speak, would not do anything at all but glare at the floor, until the whole grand room curdled with embarrassment. The chamberlain hissed, some great aunt, tittered behind her fan. And then Wenna, from her place along the wall where the unwanted are made to stand, said one low word, and both children turned, and crossed the entire length of that cold gilded room, and took her hands, one on each side, and bowed to the court together, prettily, because she had asked it of them. The silence afterward was a different sort of silence. It was the silence of a great many people doing sums again from the beginning. That, in the end, was the thing they could not forgive her. Not that the pups had chosen her. That the pups had turned out to be right. She had not forgotten what Lynette said, either, that first gray morning at the king's door. We had to pick you before the bad man could pick her. Wenna had turned the words over 100 times. Since, in the dark, the way you worry a loose tooth. There was a bad man somewhere in this bright cold house, and 2 small children knew his shape well enough to fear it, and had chosen her in part to stand between it and them. But when she watched the court, she could not for her life find him. Every face she distrusted turned out to be merely proud, or merely cruel, or merely bored. The one man she could find no fault in at all. The one warm, patient face that had only ever been gentle to her and to the pups both, belonged to the regent, Lord Rainer, and that, though she did not yet know why, was the thing that had begun very quietly to trouble her sleep. She learned the shape of the great house quickly, because she had always learned the shape of houses quickly, and the shape of this one troubled her more the longer she looked. She sat through a council once, at the very edge of it, holding a drowsing linnet against her shoulder, and watched the way the rune truly worked beneath, the way it appeared to work. The young king spoke seldom. When he did speak, it was brief and exact and hard to argue with, and then Lord Rainer would take up the thread of it in his warm, unhurried voice and gentle it into something softer and slower, and somehow by the end, always his own. And the lords would nod along at the regent, as though the king had never opened his mouth. The court called it wisdom. The old man, steadying the young one, they said, was a blessing on the realm. Wenna, watching from the wall, was no longer sure that was the thing she was seeing. It looked less like a boy being steadied, and more like a boy being quietly and lovingly held in place, by a hand so practiced and so fond that even the boy beneath it could not always feel the weight. He is weak. The whole court murmured of their king behind their soft hands. He is young and he is weak. And thank the good moon we still have Rainer to lean on. Wenna had thought exactly that once herself, over the washing in another life. She was no longer certain of it. There was a sharpness inside the young king's stillness, a way he watched a room while appearing to watch nothing in it, that did not fit the story the court so loved to tell about him. It was, she understood with some discomfort, rather close to the way she watched rooms herself, from the wall, from the edges, from the places the important people forgot to look. She might have turned that thought over a good while longer. She never got the chance. Because that same evening, hunting a lost boot through the dark of the nursery wing on her hands and knees, she rounded the corner into the low lamplight and found the Alpha King himself standing motionless in the doorway of his son's room, watching her, and she knew at once, with a cold prickle down her arms, that he had been standing there in silence for a good while already. "How long?" the king asked. "Have you been counting my stores?" Wenna's heart went sideways in her chest. She had a curtsy ready, and an apology behind it, and the lost boot still absurdly in one hand, and not one scrap of it was any use to her, because the question was not the question of a man about to send her away. It was low and sharp, and it genuinely wanted its answer. "Since my first month in the kitchens, your grace," she said, because there seemed no profit in lying to a man who had plainly already guessed the truth. 3 years, near enough to call it 3. "And what," he said, "have 3 years of counting told you?" She looked at him. He had not moved from the doorway. Behind him in the dark, both pups had gone, still in the particular rigid way of children, pretending very hard to be asleep and listening with their whole bodies. And Wenna, who had swallowed her sums for 3 years because sang them aloud, was precisely how a girl of no name lost the little she had found all at once, that she was tired past bearing of swallowing them. So she told him. She told him about the grain that came up short every second month with a clean new excuse folded around it each time. About the pup's own meat and warm milk that vanished somewhere between the pantry and the nursery, so faithfully that a person could set the hour by it. About the spears requisitioned for the East Barracks that dwindled to a handful before they ever reached the rack, and the barrels of good salt that walked out into the dusk on two men's shoulders, and, above all, the way every one of these small hungry losses ran, if a body only troubled to follow it backward, through the very same 3 offices. And answered at the bottom of all of it, to the same quiet accounting. She had never laid it all out before, not the whole of it, not at once. And it came out of her clean and cold and ordered and damning. When she finished, the king was no longer leaning in the doorway. He had come forward into the low lamplight, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at a tool he never knew he owned and discovers is exactly the shape of his own hand. "Say the last part again," he said quietly. "The 3 offices." Slowly this time. She said it again. Slowly. He was silent, a long moment. Then he said, in a voice gone flat and strange, "For a year now, I have known my house was bleeding, and I have not been able to make one single man of my council see it, or admit to seeing it. They tell me I am young. They tell me the accounts are complicated beyond me. They tell me so gently, not to trouble my head." Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before, a bleak and exhausted flicker that was almost humor. "And a girl carrying ashes worked the whole of it out in the dark. I am not clever, your grace," Wenna said. "I only pay attention. It is a great deal cheaper than being clever, and far less likely to see you thanked for it." And for the first time in all the days she had known his grave young face, the Alpha King very nearly smiled. It should not have warmed her. It did warm her, which was precisely the danger of it, because Wenna was nobody's fool, and a warm feeling inside that house was a thing to be picked up and turned over and examined all around for the hook hidden inside. He had not come looking for her because 2 small children loved her. He had come looking because she could see the thing his own sworn and salaried men could not or would not, and a king with a rot in the walls of his house, and not one soul he dared trust, has more need of a pair of clear, cheap eyes than he has of a friend. She was being used. It was almost a relief to name it plainly to herself. Being used, she understood. Being used, she knew how to survive. It was kindness with no price on it that she had never once in her life learned how to hold. "You want me to keep counting," she said. "Only now you would like to know the sum at the bottom." "I want," said the king, "one name. The single name that all the little thefts bowed down to in the end." He held her gaze steady and let the silence carry the weight of it. "You are nearer to it tonight than anyone in this house has come in a year of my trying. Will you follow it the rest of the way to the bottom?" And Wenna, who ought by every rule of survival she had ever learned to have said no, who knew perfectly well that the far end of a thread like that one was exactly the sort of place a girl of no name went quietly to disappear, heard herself ask instead the single question that truly mattered. The one whose answer turned the whole warm, careful evening to river ice beneath her feet. "Whose offices are they, your grace?" "These 3 the thread runs through." The king told her the name. And Wenna felt the floor of the world tip slowly sideways, because she had washed that man's fine linen with her own hands, and taken that man's kindly fatherly nods across a dozen corridors, and stood at the edge of a council not 3 days past, and heard that man's warm, unhurried voice gentle a whole room of hard lords into agreeing with him and thanking him for the privilege. She did not sleep on it. There is no sleeping on a thing of that shape, she told herself, lying rigid in the fine, strange bed while the pups breathed slow against her, that she had misheard him, or misunderstood, or laid the blame all wrong out of her own low dislike of being managed, because it simply could not be Lord Raynor. Everyone in the realm loved Rainer. Rainer had raised the very boy whose crown he now seemed so gently to steer. Rainer had wept, so the story went, at the old king's deathbed, and had given up his own best years to the good of the realm and asked nothing back for it. And there was no warmer or kindlier face in all of Duncrag. And yet the 3 offices were his, every one of them, filled by his own hand, loyal to his own purse. And the small hungry losses had begun, when Winna truly sat and counted them backward through the seasons, not in any accident of thin harvests or careless clerks, but in the exact turning of the year, when the young king had come of an age at last to rule without a regent standing at his shoulder. Starve the barracks, and a king cannot arm his men, empty the stores, and a king cannot feed a march to the border. Let the great house rot on quietly from its cellars up, and let the good lords go on whispering that the boy is weak, that the boy is not ready, that thank the moon they still have dear old Rainer, that perhaps the old man ought not to lay down the reins quite so soon after all. It was not theft. Theft was far too small and honest a word for it. It was a slow, patient, loving hand, keeping a grown king a child. And it had been about its work for a year, and no one at all had seen it, because the hand that did it was the one hand in the world that no one ever thought to watch. Wenna needed proof. Suspicion was worth nothing, worth less than nothing, in the mouth of a nameless kitchen girl daring to accuse the best beloved lord in the whole realm. So 3 nights later, when the great house had gone dark and quiet around her, she left the sleeping pups warm in the nursery and went down alone to the cold cellars with a shuttered lantern in her fist, to see with her own 2 eyes what it was that left the stores after dark. A delivery she had watched come in that very afternoon. Good salt meat meant for the king's own table, and the pups besides had already, by her quiet evening count, begun once more to go missing. She found the low store door unbarred, which it had no business being. She went down the last worn steps into the cold that lives under a great house, the cold that smells of stone and old salt, and the slow, patient dark, and every sensible part of her stood up at once and told her to turn around and climb back to the warm and forget she had ever counted a single sack of grain. She did not turn around. She had come too far, and been overlooked too long, and there was a small dark thread in her that had wanted, all her quiet, careful life, to be right out loud, just once, where it mattered. She found lantern light moving in the black of the vaults ahead of her, and heard the scrape of a barrel being dragged over stone, and a voice she did not know murmur a low number to another voice. And she pressed herself flat into the deeper dark of a doorway and made herself breathe slow and even, and thought, there it is at last. I have only to see the faces and be gone. She saw one face. She would have sworn to it before any court in the land. It was one of Rainer's 3, the soft-handed storeman from the middle office, and he was not stealing the meat at all. He was doing something to it, quick and neat and practiced, from a small dark bottle held careful in 2 fingers, and then packing each piece back up as tidy as it had come, to go up in the morning to the very tables it had been carved for. Not theft. Not tonight. Tonight was a far worse thing than theft, and it was bound up the stairs for the king's own plate. Wenna must have made some small sound. She never afterward knew what sound it was. But the storeman's head came up sharp, and the lantern swung round toward her doorway, and a second man she had never seen at all was already moving, fast and low and horribly silent along the wall, straight for the black corner where she stood with her own light shuttered and her heart slamming at her ribs, and nowhere in the wide world left to run. Someone's behind the salt, the storeman said, very softly, very calm. A girl, by the smell. Don't you let her reach the stair? What saved her was not courage and not cleverness. It was 2 children 100 stone steps above her, who had woken to a cold bed and reached half asleep for the warm shape that should have been in it and found it gone. Far up in the dark of the sleeping palace, faint and thin and rising, Two small wolves began to howl for their lost Wenna, and the terrible sound of it fell down the stairwells like water, and the moving man checked one half step to listen. Half a step was all she had, and all she needed. Wenna went up the black stair blind, skirts in both fists, quicker than she had ever moved in her life, the men crashing up behind her, and she hit the top and the cold night air, and ran full into someone standing quiet in the dark at the head of the stair. Someone who caught her gently by both arms and held her still with a strength that did not match his years, and looked down at her with the kindest, sorriest, most patient old face in all the realm. "Child," said Lord Rainer softly, not the least bit out of breath, "you are a very long way from the nursery tonight. Before we go on, let me ask one small thing of you. If this story has its hooks in you, the way two small wolves once had their hooks in a kitchen omega, take a moment and subscribe, so the next tale can find its way to you when it is ready." Back to the cold top of the stair, and the kindest old man in the realm. "You are a very long way from the nursery," Lord Rainer said again, gently, and did not let go of her arms. Wenna made herself go slack and frightened, which was not difficult, because she was frightened straight through to the bone. "I heard the pups crying, my lord," she said, and let her voice shake, and let the shake be as true as it wanted to be. "I went the wrong way in the dark. I always go the wrong way in the dark. I am sorry, my lord. I only wanted to get back to them before they woke the whole wing." For a long moment the old man studied her face by the thin light at the head of the stair, and she felt him weighing her, the way she had watched him weigh a whole hard counsel from the king's right hand. She kept her own eyes wide and stupid and full of nothing but the nursery. And whatever he read in her there, or chose to let himself read, at last he loosed her arms and stepped back, and became again, between one breath and the next, the warm, sorrowing grandfather. "The dark is no place for a girl alone," he said. "You must take more care of yourself. A great old house is full of stairs. A careless person can fall down, and no one the wiser till morning." He smiled at her, and the smile was gentle, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. "Go up to the children now. They are calling for you. It seems the poor lambs cannot rest at all, unless they know exactly where you are." She fled up the stair with her heart going like a fist on a door, and she did not let herself understand it until she was through the nursery door, with both warm gray shapes pressed shaking against her, that the kindest old man in the realm had just told her, smiling, in his softest voice, precisely how easily and how quietly she could be made to fall. She went to the king at first light. He listened to the whole of it without one word, standing at his wall of maps, with the gray dawn coming up cold behind him. And when she told him of the small dark bottle and the meat packed careful to go back up to his own table, something went out of his face and left it very still and very old, older than his years by a long road. He did not send for the guard. He did not shout, "The house awake." He simply crossed the room and drew a bell cord twice in a pattern she did not know, and quietly, with no fuss and no loud order that might carry to the wrong listening ear, the tainted delivery was drawn back out of the kitchens before the first loaves went into the ovens. And then the king of all Kelvane stood in the grey light, holding the cold proof of his own near death in his two hands, and looked, for one unguarded moment, more alone than any man Wenna had ever seen. "You understand that I can do nothing," he said low. "Not yet. I have a bottle, and a storeman who will swear he never saw it, and the word of a kitchen girl, and against all of that, I have a man this realm would take up arms to defend. If I move on him now with only this, the lords will say the boy king has run mad and turned on the very father who raised him, and they will be half right, and Rainer will weep his beautiful honest tears, and I will lose the crown inside a month, and my sons inside 2. His jaw worked. "He raised me. Did you know that? My own father was a cold and distant star of a man. and it was Rainer who taught me to sit a horse, and to read a treaty, and to grieve my mother without shame. Everything gentle. I know of the world I learned, from the same two hands that have spent this whole year trying to keep me a child forever, and may, if I give him the opening, decide to keep me dead. And there it was, the one true piece of himself, laid in her hands in the cold dawn light. The particular loneliness of a man who cannot trust the single person who ever troubled to teach him what trust was. Saz. Wenna, who had spent the whole of her own life not being trusted with anything more precious than the ashes, felt something deep, in her turn, slowly over, and go warm and dangerous. "Then we get you proof he cannot weep his way clear of," she said. They began to work in the dark after that, the two of them, in stolen and secret hours over tallies and old muster rolls and the small, cold logic of who had placed which man in which office, and when. He did not send her away, and she did not go. And whatever it is that grows between two people who sit up too late and too close, over a shared and deadly secret, it grew, quietly, the green thing that comes up through a cracked stone, in spite of everything. She caught him watching her, sometimes, over the low candle. She caught herself watching back and looking away too slow. And the pups, who had after all begun the whole of it, slept in a warm, tangled heap between the two of them, as if the world had finally arranged itself into the shape they had always patiently known it was meant to be. "I need you to do one more dangerous thing," he told her one night when the candle had burned to a stub, and his voice was not a king's voice at all. "And I find, to my own surprise, that I do not want to ask it of you." "Ask it anyway," Wenna said. He looked at her a long moment across the guttering light. And then he reached across the little table slowly, the way a man reaches toward something that might startle and bolt, and laid his hand over hers, and left it there. It was the first time he had ever touched her. And Wenna, who had 100 good and bitter reasons to draw her hand away and not one single true wish to do it, understood with a lurch of pure cold alarm that somewhere in all those careful secret hours she had gone and done the one thing a girl of no name must never ever do inside a king's great house. She had started to fall. The plan was simple, which is the only kind of plan that is ever any good. Wenna would let herself be seen to know too much. She would let Rainer come to believe she had proof, real proof, written and witnessed, and that she knew where it was safely kept, and she would let him come for it. And when the beloved regent of all Kelvane reached out his warm old hand in the dark to quiet a troublesome kitchen girl for good, the king would have him at last in the open red-handed, before witnesses too many and too high to be wept aside. It was a good plan and a wicked one, because the bait at the center of it was her, and both of them knew it, and only one of them lay awake, sick over it. She had agreed to it without a flicker, of course, because agreeing without a flicker was a thing she was good at. But lying awake that last night, she let herself feel the whole cold shape of what she had agreed to. She was to walk out on purpose in front of a man who fed poison to children, and let him decide she was worth killing. She had spent her whole quiet life making herself too small and too useful to be worth anyone's trouble, and now her single value, the only coin she had left to spend for these two children, was to make herself worth exactly that trouble and survive the making. It was, she thought, a strange sort of promotion. A girl of no name had finally become important enough to be rid of. The night before they set it running, she could not sleep, and neither, it seemed, could the king. She found him in the nursery doorway again, a tall, dark shape against the banked red fire, watching his sleeping sons, and this time she did not startle at the sight of him. She came and stood beside him in the warm dark, close but not touching, and for a long while the two of them simply stood and watched the pups breathe, the small rise and fall of them, the way the little ones twitched and ran in their dreams. "Their mother used to stand exactly here," he said at last, very quietly. She could not sleep either. Near the end, She said she wanted to memorize them, every hair, in case she did not get to do it later. He was silent a moment, and the fire ticked. She never got to see them run. They were barely up on 2 legs when the fever took her, and never up on 4 at all while she lived. Bracken does not remember her. Not truly, though he will not say so. Lynette believes she remembers, but it is only the things I have told her, worn smooth and shapeless now, from all the handling. His voice did something complicated and low. For 3 years I could not make myself come down here. I would stand in this doorway, this exact spot where you are standing, and I could not cross it, because everything on the other side of it had been hers, and she was not in it, and I was too great a coward to be their whole world, when I could not stop grieving long enough to be even half of one. So a kitchen girl carried the ashes down instead, and sat on the cold floor, and did the thing their own father was too broken to do. And I told myself, every day, that I resented you for it. He turned his head and looked at her. I have never been so grateful to any living soul as I have been to you. And I have never been so ashamed of anything as of that gratitude. Both at once, every single day. Wenna found she could not speak at all. My name, he said after a while, still watching her, since you have never once used it in all these weeks, and since I find tonight that I would give a great deal to hear you use it, is Halvard. Halvard, she said, and it came out of her far softer than she had meant it to, softer than she had said any word in years. And he closed his eyes as though she had reached out and done something to him with her bare hands. What passed between them then was not the crash and thunder of a storm. It was the quiet, final turning of a key in a lock that had rusted shut so long ago that neither of them had believed it could turn at all. He lifted one hand and touched her face, careful, wondering, and she let him, and turned her cheek the smallest fraction into the warmth of his palm. He said her name the way no one in the whole of that cold gilded house had ever once said it, as though it were a thing worth the saying, worth the whole breath it cost. And she found she was holding the front of his coat in both her fists, gripping it the way a woman grips something to keep from going under dark water. And when at last he bent and rested his forehead against hers, they simply stood there, breathing the same warm air. 2 people who had each been alone for so long that they had honestly forgotten the world could hold anything else. The pups slept on between their feet. Nothing more happened than a man and a woman deciding, without one further word spoken, that they were finished. The both of them, with being alone. It was more than enough. It was, Wenna thought, with something that frightened her by how much it felt like joy, the very most that had ever happened to her in her life. She should have known better than to let herself be that happy in that house on that particular night. She could not sleep afterward for the sheer bright unfamiliar weight of it sitting in her chest, and so it was Wenna, drifting the dark passage past the king's own study, in search of a cup of water and a quiet moment to simply hold her own glad, astonished heart, who saw the thin gold line of candlelight beneath his door, and heard his low voice inside. And heard, answering it, the clipped voice of Captain Duran, his captain of the guard, making some late report, and who stopped dead in the passage, because the report had her own name in the middle of it. She walked down into the cellar exactly as you said she would, Your Grace, Dorn was saying, low and pleased. You called it near to the hour. You said, give the girl a loose thread, and her own nature will walk her straight down into the dark after it, and never once think to stop, and that is precisely what she did. And the king's voice, tired, and low, and terribly, terribly calm, said, good, then she has served her purpose well. Keep her walking a little longer yet. I need him to reach for her out in the open, where they can all see it, and a careful man will not reach for a girl who has already stopped being useful to anyone. Wenna stood alone in the cold passage with the empty cup in her hand, and felt the beautiful turning key go still inside her and then, slowly, deliberately, turn itself all the way back the other way, and lock. That was the strange small thing she would remember about it, long afterward. She had always imagined a heart broke loudly, with noise and heat, but hers broke, without a single sound, there in the cold passage, so quietly that the two men behind the study door never knew that she had come, or heard, or gone. She had named it herself, that very first night in the lamplight. I am being used. She had said the words aloud, and felt almost the ease of relief in them, because being used was a thing she understood in her bones. Being used was a thing she had always known how to survive. And then he had gone and laid his warm hand over hers, and said her name, like a small holy word, and she had let herself forget, like the greenest fool in the kingdom, the one hard truth she had known from the very beginning, which was that a girl of no name is a tool in a great man's house, and that the kindest thing a tool is ever told, at the end of its use, is that it has served well. He had called her nature to the hour. He had handed her the loose thread, knowing exactly where it ran, and exactly what she was made of, and he had let her walk down alone into the poison dark, because a kitchen girl was a coin he could spend, and his sworn armored men were not. And everything after, the low candle, the forehead against hers, the name, given like a gift in the firelight, was only the plan, keeping her walking a little longer down the road toward the trap. She went back to the nursery, and lay down between the two sleeping pups, and stared up at the black ceiling, until the dawn bells, and when they rang, she rose and washed her cold face, and went out to play the bait, exactly as she had promised she would. Because whatever else she was, whatever foolish thing she had let herself briefly become, she was not, and would never be, a woman who left two motherless children to a poisoner over the matter of her own quietly broken heart. That was the day the whole of it came apart, and it came apart faster and uglier than any of them had planned, because Lord Raynor had at last run entirely out of patience with waiting, and Lord Raynor had a plan of his own that no one had thought to expect. It began at the noon audience in the full and crowded great hall, before the whole of the assembled court. It began, as the very worst things so often do, with kindness. The old regent rose slowly in his place at the king's right hand, and spread his warm, sorrowing hands wide, and said that it grieved him past all speaking, that he had prayed not to be the one to say it, but that he could hold his tongue no longer, not for the safety of the realm. There was a poisoner, loose, within the palace walls. He had proof of it now, gathered in sorrow, and the proof, he was heartbroken beyond words to tell them, led directly and unmistakably to the king's own ward. To the kitchen girl the poor bewitched children had dragged up out of the lower dark. The girl who had been seen, these many nights past, by more than one honest frightened servant, creeping about the king's own stores, with a shuttered lantern in her hand, meddling in the dark with the king's own food. The hall gasped as one animal. It was perfect. It was the whole truth turned exactly inside out, and handed, still warm, to a court that had been longing from the first hour to believe the very worst of her. And Wenna saw, in one single cold clear instant, precisely how it would all go from here, how the soft-handed storeman would swear to it on his knees, how her lantern, and her counting, and her long night walks through the cellars, would every one of them be turned and made to condemn her, how a girl of no name would be dragged out and condemned for the exact crime she had risked her life in the dark to uncover, and how Lord Raynor, having gently and tearfully removed the one clear pair of eyes in all the realm that had ever truly seen him, would fold the grieving boy king back beneath his warm gray wing and rule on and on and on. And the king said nothing. She looked up at him on his high carved seat, and he sat as still and gray as carved stone, and he did not speak one single word in her defense. And the last small, warm, foolish flame in her heart went out like a wick pinched between two fingers. Of course he would let it fall on her. She had served her purpose. A tool that has served, and then turned dangerous by knowing too much, is not defended before a court, it is quietly set down. Have you nothing at all to say for yourself, girl? Said Rainer, so gently, so terribly sadly, into the awful ringing quiet. And Wenna, alone and friendless, and with the whole vast gold hall turned as one to watch her fall, lifted her chin. Because if she had learned one single useful thing across a whole life of being overlooked and stepped past, it was exactly how to stand up very straight, while important people decided among themselves what was to become of her. Only a question, my lord, she said, and her clear, plain voice carried far further than she had expected across the marble hush. You say I was seen creeping the stores these many nights. Seen by whom, my lord? For the only living souls down in those cellars after dark were your own 3 storemen, and one man among them who packed poison into the king's own meat from a small black bottle held careful in 2 fingers, and me, watching him do it. So which of us was it, my lord, that saw me there? Name him for these good people. And then let us all of us ask that honest, frightened man, out loud before the whole court, what business he had down in that dark himself, to have been there to see me at all. For the space of half a single heartbeat, the old man's kind and sorrowing face did not change at all. And in that half a heartbeat, before any soul in the hall could speak or move, the great doors at the far end boomed open on a gust of cold outside air, exactly, precisely, as they had on the long-ago night that all of this began. Only this time the herald's cracked voice cried a name that Wenna knew, because the king himself had spoken it to her low over the maps in the dark. Wulfric of Merowmere. Wulf, Lord of the Grey Border. Father of the dead queen. Grandsire to 2 small, stolen princes. Come at long last up the hard 9 days of road to see, with his own 2 eyes, why the word had reached him across all that distance that his dead daughter's sons were kept ill and neglected, and in mortal danger in the house of the very man who had married her. He came up the length of the great hall like weather rolling in off a cold sea. He was old, Wulfric, as old in his years as Rainer was in his, but where the regent had gone all soft and warm and grandfatherly, with his age the wolf lord had gone hard and grey and honed as a whetstone, and he wore the 9 days of the road on him still, mud to the knee, and 2 enormous grey wolfhounds paced silent at his heels with their heads low. And the whole glittering, perfumed court of Duncrag drew back a step from him without ever quite deciding to. He did not bow to the throne, he did not so much as incline his grey head to it. He stopped in the very center of the hall, beneath the great chandelier, and swept the whole gathered room once, with a pale, flat, unhurried stare, and said, in a voice like a slow landslide of stones, I am told my grandsons are ill kept in this soft place. I am told there is poison loose in these fine walls. I rode 9 days on that telling, and ruined a good horse doing it. Someone here had best make the ride worth my while, and quickly. And then 2 things happened in the great hall at once. The first was that Bracken and Linnet, who had been shut up in a small side chamber for the grim business of the audience, and had heard thin, through the heavy door, the one single voice in all the wide world that carried the ghost of their mother folded inside it, came bursting through that door like 2 loosed grey arrows, and they did not run to the fearsome grandfather they had never once met, and they did not run to their own father high on his cold carved throne. They ran, the both of them, together, straight across the whole length of that vast, staring hall, to Wenna. And they set themselves down hard at her 2 sides, one small, warm, furious body pressed to each of her hands, and they turned as one to face the assembled court, exactly, precisely, as they had turned on the far-off night of the banquet, small and shaking and holy and immovably certain. And Linnet lifted one small pointing finger, and aimed it clear across the hall, at the kind old, sorrowing regent, and said in her high, clear, carrying, child's voice, the plain thing that she had known and named from the very first grey morning, long before any of the clever grown people had troubled themselves to work it out. That is the bad man. That is the one who hurts the food, I told her. I told her at the start. The second thing that happened was that Lord Rainer, seeing the whole careful shape of his year come apart around him in a single instant, seeing the grey wolf lord, and the pointing child, and the girl who simply would not go quietly as she was told, stopped, at long last. It was a very small movement, a soft, old hand slipping into a wide sleeve, a single step taken toward the pointing child, because a poisoner who has run clean out of victims to frame will in the end settle for silencing the smallest and most certain witness against him. But Wenna had spent 3 long years of her life watching that man's soft hands from the edges of rooms, and she was already moving before she had decided to move, and she put her own body square between Lord Rainer and the 2 children, with nothing at all in her 2 hands to defend them with. And what she had instead of a blade was her voice, pitched now to carry to the furthest cold corner of the king's great hall. His right sleeve, she cried out. Whatever he is reaching for, it is in his right sleeve. The very same bottle. Look at it, all of you. Look now. Look at the kindest man in the realm. Reach his hand toward a motherless child in front of your own eyes, and then you tell me, to my face, which of the 2 of us here is the poisoner. And she caught his reaching wrist in both her flower-strong scrubbing hands, and she held it up high, straining, for the whole court to see. And the small dark bottle slid loose from the fine old sleeve, and fell, and shattered on the cold marble of the king's own hall. And the smell of the thing rose up out of the broken glass, sharp and green, and deeply wrong, in front of 6 holes, and a border wolf lord and a boy king and the whole staring court, and it could not be wept away. The hall erupted like a kicked hive. It was over very quickly after that. The way a thing that has been quietly rotten for a long time goes all at once, when at last it finally goes. Wulfric's 2 grey hounds had the regent's men off their feet and pinned howling to the marble before the king's own guards had cleared their blades. And the king was on his feet and speaking at last, cold and clear and carrying, every inch of him, the man the frightened court had been assured. For a year he was far too weak and green to be. He named the 3 offices. He named the storemen. He named the whole slow, patient year of small, hungry thefts, and the salt, and the spears, and the grain, and the deep design. Beneath all of it, the long, quiet, loving plot to keep a grown-crowned king a helpless child. And the great lords, who had nodded so long and so comfortably at Rainer's shoulder, went grey in the face, and each and every one of them discovered, suddenly, that he had always, in his private heart, harbored the gravest suspicions of the man. They took the old regent away, still weeping, still protesting his poor, broken, loving heart, and not one soul in all that great hall wept with him or for him. And Wenna stood in the very middle of all of it, with 2 children pressed hard and trembling to her sides, and shattered green glass at her feet, wholly and completely vindicated before the entire assembled realm. And she had never once, in the whole of her life, felt less like celebrating anything. The king came down from his high seat, then, through the wreck of his own court, straight to her, and there was something raw and open working in his grey, tired face, some word he had waited too long to say, and meant at last to say now. He put out his hand toward her, and Wenna, with the whole hall watching, did not take it. She gathered the 2 shaking pups closer instead, and turned her shoulder to him, gently, the way a person turns a page, and she felt him stop where he stood, as though he had walked into a wall he had built himself, and forgotten was there, because the king had found his true voice. At last there in the hall, he had simply found it, one single heartbeat, too late to have thought to find it first for her. He came to her that same evening, and she would not see him. He came again the next day and the next, after that, and Wenna kept to the nursery, and kept the 2 children close about her, and sent each of his folded messages back to him unopened, one after another. And so, the king of all Kelvain, a man who could by a word command any single thing in the whole of his realm, save the one thing that he truly wanted, learned for himself, slowly, what it is to stand a long time outside a shut door that will not open to you no matter how you knock. Wulfric came to see her before he rode the 9 days home. The old grey wolf lord sat himself down in the small, warm nursery like a boulder set incongruous in the middle of a flower bed, and watched, without expression, as his 2 grandsons climbed fearlessly all over him, tugging his grey braids, testing him, and then he turned his pale, flat gaze on Wenna and said bluntly, with no softening in it anywhere, "They tell me you are the reason my grandsons are drawing breath tonight. They tell me the king made use of you to catch his snake for him, and then sat still as a stone on his fine chair, and never lifted one hand when the snake turned round and struck at you in the open hall." He grunted, deep in his chest a sound like a rockfall settling. Men who are born to rule are all of them cut from the one cloth girl. They spend the things they love, and then they name the spending strategy, and they sleep well enough after. My own daughter married one such, and it did not make her happy. In the end, whatever else it made her. Do not make her same mistake twice over. Not unless he proves to you he has learned better of it than the last one ever troubled to. And he laid one enormous scarred hand, with terrible gentleness, upon each small grey head in turn. And then he rose, and he left, and his going took the very last of the danger out of the house with him, and left behind it only the wreckage of the thing that mattered. She fully meant to leave. She had a plan for the leaving, the way she had always had a plan ready for everything in her careful, guarded life. She would see the 2 pups settled first, with a nurse. They could at last bear to be near, now that the poison was gone from the walls, and the great house was safe again. And then she would take the small, honest wage that the claim had earned her in the end, and she would go, quietly, somewhere far off where no living soul had ever so much as heard the words King's Ward. And she would be, for the first time and the whole of her life, no one's tool, and no one's charge, and no one's kitchen girl, and no one's bait, only herself, and free. It was a very good plan. She lay awake in the dark and hated every single piece of it. He came to her at last on the 7th evening, and this time he did not send any message ahead of himself to be refused. And this time he did not come to her as a king. He came alone, on his own 2 feet, with no guard at his back and no crown on his head, and no clever waiting plan folded up his sleeve, and he stopped in the doorway of the nursery. The same doorway he had once been too afraid and too grieved to cross. He only stood in it, undefended, with his empty hands open at his sides, and said, "I have no right left to ask you for anything at all. I know it, so I have not come to ask. I have come to give you the whole truth instead, all of it, and then to go away and leave you in peace, if that is what you tell me to do." Wenna said nothing at all. She had learned that much from him, at least. "Every word you heard through my study door was true," he said. "I called your nature to the very hour. I handed you the loose thread. I let you walk down alone into the dark because you were a kitchen girl and my sworn men were not, and I told myself the whole time that it was strategy, because a man who was taught how to trust by the same person, now patiently trying to be rid of him, learns, in the end, to trust nothing in the world, least of all his own foolish heart on the night it starts, against all sense and all his own hard rules, to want something for itself." His voice cracked clean across, and he let it crack, and did not look away from her. "And then I sat on my throne and I watched that man turn a whole court against you, in an afternoon, and I said nothing, because even then, even with your life on the scale, I was still playing the longer, colder game, still waiting for him to reach far enough into the open that no lord could later doubt it. I chose my crown over you, in front of every soul in that hall, and I will regret the doing of it every single day that I am given left to live. You were never once a tool to me. That is the very worst of it, and the truest thing I have. You stopped being a tool to me the night you stood in my son's doorway and told me you only pay attention because it is a great deal cheaper than being clever. And I let you go on, believing you were still nothing but a tool to me anyway, because it felt safer, coward that I am, than saying out loud what you had truly become. And then, the king of all Kelvane went down, slowly, onto one knee, on the bare boards of a nursery doorway, in front of a kitchen girl and his own two watching sons, with nothing whatsoever in his open hands. My sons claimed you before witnesses, he said, low, looking up at her. And I stood there and told you the old law would not permit me to undo it, as though it were a great heavy burden laid upon me. It was the only wholly good thing that has happened to this house since their mother was carried out of it, and I was too proud and too frightened of my own heart to say so out loud, even to myself. So I am claiming you now. Myself. Here, in front of them, with my own mouth, in exactly the same undefended way that they did it, with no crown left to hide behind, and no strategy left to spend. And you may do to me now precisely the thing that I did to you. You may look at me and tell me that I have served my turn, and set me down, and walk away out of this house forever. And there will be no taking it back. I have already seen to it that the whole of my court knows their king went down on his knee tonight to a kitchen girl. Whatever it is that you answer me, I cannot unkneel it. This time it is you who holds the power to break the thing, and me who cannot. He drew one unsteady breath. So, choose me back, Wenna, or do not choose me at all. But the choosing, this time, is wholly and only yours. For a long, long moment Wenna looked down at the man kneeling on the bare boards in front of her, the king of all the land undefended in a nursery doorway, and then at the two small children looking up at her with their whole hopeful hearts open in their faces, and she felt every guarded, careful, overlooked year of her whole life pulling hard at her, pulling her back toward the good safe plan, and the quiet road out, and the clean, cold freedom of belonging to absolutely no one ever again. Not tonight, she said at last. And she watched him flinch, as though struck, and she did not soften it. For him, not 1 degree, because she had earned this much. And more, you broke it in front of the whole court, Halvard. You may spend a good long while mending it in the very same place, out where they can all watch you do it. Ask me again, when there is no longer any game left to be won by the asking, and no snake left to be caught, and nothing at all in it for you, but only me. Ask me again, when it is only wanting, plain and useless, with no reason underneath it but the wanting itself. She crouched down slowly to the floor, and gathered the two anxious, trembling pups in against her, and looked at him steadily over their two gray heads. And if you still find that you mean it then? In the plain gray cold light of some ordinary morning, with not one single thing in the whole world left to gain by it, then you ask me, Halvard, and you find out. In the end, it took him the better part of a whole year. He asked her badly, and he asked her often. He asked her across the long council table until his hard old lords learned to study their papers very intently. He asked her out on the cold east wall with the wind snatching half the words away. He asked her once in the very middle of the lower kitchens, to the undying delight of every soul below stairs, standing among the same ovens where she had once fed his motherless sons from off her own plate. And Bettany laughed so hard that she had to sit down on a full sack of the good grain that did not, these days, ever go missing anymore. He did not ask her as a king asks. He learned, slowly and clumsily and in front of everyone, to ask her as a man asks, which was the only way she had ever wanted to be asked, and the one way no one had ever thought to teach him. And every time she told him, gently now, to ask her again tomorrow, not to be cruel to him, only because she had spent the whole of her life being certain of nothing at all, and she found that she wanted, just this one time, before she said the word, to be entirely certain of this. She watched him become, month by slow month, the very man that the two pups had always somehow stubbornly known, was in there waiting. She watched him learn his own children by heart, learn that Bracken needed the plain truth to his face, and Linnet needed most of all to be told it was safe now, to know the true things she knew. And somewhere in all of that long, patient watching, the guarded, careful, frightened thing that had lived so long in Wenna's own chest, quietly, and entirely without asking her permission, unlocked itself and stayed unlocked. So that on one perfectly ordinary morning, a gray and unremarkable morning, with cold rain coming on against the glass, and the porridge going lumpy in the bowls, and both pups squabbling furiously over a single carved wooden horse, the king looked up at her across the small warm chaos of it all, and he did not ask her anything at all this time. He only looked at her, and Wenna set down the spoon that she was holding, and looked back at him and said, "Yes, all right. Yes. Ask me tomorrow, too, if you like. But the answer is going to be yes." The whole city came out into the streets for it. The plain kitchen girl, that two mischievous wolf pups had chosen over 6 great holes and a crown, and the boy king the whole realm had once so cheerfully agreed, was far too weak to hold his own house, who had turned out to hold it after all, and to have needed nothing to do it, but one single person willing to look him full in the face and see the man there instead of the crown. Wulfric came the 9 hard days from Marrowmere for it, and did not smile the whole while, but he laid his great scarred hand upon Wenna's head the way he laid it upon his grandson's, which from that old man was very nearly the same as weeping openly. Bracken carried the rings and dropped one, and had to be helped to find it under a bench. Linnet did not drop hers, because Linnet, then and always, never once let go of anything she had truly decided to keep. "You are stuck with me now," Hallvard murmured low to her, when it was at last all done, echoing his own 2 sons, without ever knowing that he did it, "and there is no taking it back. I know exactly how the old law works. I have read it a great deal more carefully than ever you have. Your children claimed me first, if you will recall, in front of the entire court, long before you ever once managed to find the nerve to do it yourself." And she smiled up at him, the girl of no name, who had counted every small, quiet loss in a great cold house, and been proven right in the end about the whole of it, and most of all, about this. But this one, Hallvard, I claimed all by myself, and that, I have found, is the only kind of claim in the whole world that ever truly holds. He keeps a quiet watch over her now, some nights. She wakes in the dark and finds him standing in the doorway, not afraid of it anymore, only looking, watching her breathe, the way she once stood her own long guard over 2 grieving motherless pups in the dark under the stairs. He tells her he is only making certain that all is well. She lets him go on, believing she does not know what he is truly doing there. It is a very small thing to give back to a man who was alone for such a long time, and Wenna has counted, across her own careful life, a great and bitter many small things going quietly missing in the dark. She does not mind, in the least, giving these particular small ones back, and that is the whole of it. 2 mischievous wolf pups crashed a king's grand banquet, and turned out to be right about every single thing, and mended a whole rotten house from its cold cellars up, simply and stubbornly by refusing to sit down anywhere in all the world but beside the one overlooked person that nobody else had ever once bothered to truly see.